Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another edition of ONResearch Talks. My name is Ikpeazu, and I'll be your host today. Today's talk is themed Political Leadership that Drives Economic Growth in Frontier Market Contexts. And with me for this discussion is a pioneering female leader and political economist, Dr. Oby Ezekwesili, who has served as the Vice President of the World Bank's Africa region, Minister of Education in the government of Nigeria, as well as a founding director of Transparency International, among many other positions. Thank you so much for joining the discussion today, Dr. Oby.
Hello, good. Pleasure to speak with you.
Thank you. We'll jump straight into it. I'm sure you will agree that we are having this discussion in an interesting global political context. While we're not here to talk about the COVID-19 pandemic per se, it's impossible to ignore the impact that this has had on humanity outside of the health space. And I'm talking about multilateralism, the global economy, and economic growth in the context of the African continent. Coming out of the acute phase of the pandemic, so really the really hardest phase, was possible thanks to critical political decisions that were made early on. And for many governments, approaching these decisions required a balancing act between national contexts and geopolitical considerations. So can you tell us, as a minister in various roles with the Nigerian government, you had to deal with a complex social and economic landscape. What was one of the more difficult decisions that you had to take in the process of state building?
I seem to have missed the last bit of the sentence. So
okay.
Could you, yes.
Yes, so I was saying that as a minister in various roles for the Nigerian government, you had to deal with a complex social and economic landscape. What was one of the more difficult decisions that you had to take in the process of state building?
I think the key one is understanding that the problems in the public space, in the public sphere of society, could be of two kinds. They could be technical problems and they could be adaptive problems. Technical problems require technical solutions. And so at a certain level, with technical problems, you can find very clear-cut solutions. If you have an engineering problem, it's easy to find an engineering solution. You have, certain kinds of very straightforward technical challenges. You can fix them, right? But the other part of the second part of the second type of problems that you find in the public space are what we call the adaptive challenges. And with adaptive challenges, there's much more that would need to be done, because adaptive challenges are challenges that go to the core of behavior and values within society and the way that society basically, organizes itself in terms of its choices, the behavior that it rewards, the behavior that it sanctions. And, so that whole space on adaptive challenges would include, things that where you're needing society to make a dramatic turnaround from acting in a certain kind of way. So if you're leading in the public space, you have to be ready to have the skills to identify problems well. So during my time, it was the complexity of knowing which problems I was needing to solve at any point in time. Was I confronting technical problems, or was I confronting adaptive problems? And if I needed my solutions, how could I empirically establish which solution was best for what kind of problems? And the result of it was that such analytical process enabled me to avoid wasting time. Because when you are in public office, time is an enemy. You have to maximize your productivity. And so being analytically grounded in the way that you are diagnosing the challenges and knowing what solution is best for what problem would actually gain you a lot of mileage. And I don't know if you followed some of the reports that have been done in the evaluation of why female political leaders seem to have performed better than their male counterparts during this period of the pandemic. And some of them have come to that place where people, some of the studies that I've seen are pointing to some attributes that women as leaders actually use, they leverage it. And one of those is this ability to really scrutinize problems in ways that are very detailed, are very granular, and being able to identify which problem requires a certain kind of approach, as different from sometimes the way that their male counterparts do it. So that would be my answer to you on that.
Thank you very much. It's very interesting that you mentioned the approach to sort of understanding, diagnosing and understanding the problem. Can you tell us a bit about a current initiative that you're working on that emerged as a result of sort of this approach that you've built over time?
So you know that I did, out of frustration with the poor governance of the country, I who had no bone in my body that resembled anything of a politician, ultimately had this level of frustration where it was either I ran for office or I simply packed my luggage and left the country to the design of the really reckless political class that we have. I chose rather to stay and then to do one more thing, because I mean I've done private sector, done public sector, done civil society, done international development, and I've been very focused on a constant, and that constant is that everything that I do must be leading toward good governance of our society, because good governance is the greatest leverage that a society can have toward progress. And so I had no interest in politics. I didn't care for what the politicians would do in order to then, you would have a government. I always felt that once you had a government, you could do things in the area of policy and institutions building in ways that would foster the kind of good outcomes that are necessary for citizens' well-being. That's what I thought until I realized that we were getting it wrong, and that policies and institutions building and all other things that we do at that technical level would actually be easily destroyed by the kind of political mindset and culture on which they are designed. And I saw that because for 6.5 years that I was a minister in government, and as well as I was in charge of, as an aide to the president, was in charge of the reform of our public procurement system. I was in charge of the implementation of the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, such that Nigeria became a global standard for other countries. In those 6.5 years, doing education as minister, doing mineral sector as minister, and then being part of the economic team and also being a part of the power sector reform team, plus these other two that I talked about earlier. And then coming out of government after 6.5 years and just watching how politics undermined the reforms of that period. You could see that, wow, we needed to interrogate what we believed a little bit more. So that interrogation and that restlessness about seeing the country not unravel on an accelerated path just moved me to running for office. And you have to remember that my frustration started badly when the two governments could not give rescue to the girls who had been abducted, girls who went to school in the northern part of the country, in Chibok, Borno State, and 219 of them were carted off by terrorists. And the government under which they were abducted, was so tentative, they didn't take the right kind of actions in the early days of the abduction, didn't even acknowledge their abduction, and it was terrible. We had to be out there on the street protesting and asking for action for the girls. And it was such a disappointment in my country. I'd never been more disappointed because I felt like we were unfair to them because they were they are children of the poorer segment of our society. And that if children from elite families, from middle-class families even, had been so affected, the government wouldn't have been negligent of them. And so it was absolutely a painful thing to then watch a second administration take over from the first one and repeat the same pattern. So I came to the conclusion that our political class had simply the same, and that we needed to reinvent our political class, and that we needed to get a new political culture that would put the interest of all citizens ahead of the interest of the politicians. And so I ran for political office as a way of signaling that that's what I want to see in our society. In running for political office, I ended up even learning more. And what I would say I learned more was how broken the political system was, and that it was not by mistake that governance was not working. Our politics is designed to not enable governance work. And so I stepped down from running when I realized that it was going to require me to actually negotiate my values in order to stay on with the political party that I was running on their ticket. And I wasn't prepared to do that. So I stepped down from running, and I decided to go spend time at the Robert Bosch Academy as a Richard von Weizsäcker Fellow at the Robert Bosch Academy in Berlin to do a research into the nexus between politics and economic performance of countries. And so my analytical approach came to the fore in that research, because I was able to establish a very strong correlation between the poor state of politics on our continent, and especially our country, Nigeria, and the dismal economic performance of our country and continent. So the conclusion of my research basically says that Africa's democracies are monopolistic type democracies, which is an aberration. And then I used the same economic modeling term to then identify what you do to correct a monopolistic situation. to correct a monopolistic situation would require your addressing the fault lines along the three critical pillars that make up a triangle of intersection, a triangle of relationship between the consumers, the suppliers, and the regulators. And in the case of a democratic context, it is the electorate, the politicians, and the ombudsman, or it's the regulatory, constitutional, and legal context within which they interact. So that research has led to a number of initiatives that are addressing the matter of empowering and emerging an empowered and engaged electorate, because the current electorate on our continent don't have influence to actually determine political outcomes that are favorable to them. So they do not have enough influence over the democratic process, and you have to change that. And then the other part of it is that the quality of the political class on our continent is so low, and it is so entrenched in bad behavior. And so the political culture within which they have grown and come to accept as the norm is one that subordinates the public good, the common good, for their personal interests, for narrow interests. So they don't serve the common good. And then you look at the regulatory context of our politics, and you find that there is regulatory capture. So whether it's constitutional order or the political institutions that regulate, like the electoral bodies and maybe even the judiciary, they are somehow submerged into the powers of the political class. So when you have this situation, the political space is monopolized by these groups, these two groups acting almost as one, while the electorate are left at the margins of the political space. And so you have to correct that if you're going to correct Africa's politics. And that's what my research was about. And the findings are now leading to the initiatives that we have going. One of the principal one being the School of Politics, Policy and Governance, known as the SPPG, where we are using unconventional curriculum to raise a new pipeline of leaders who are going to run for political office on a different mindset and based on a different set of competencies on matters of economic policy, all kinds of social policies, everything to do with institutions building and policies and processes and systems, and then basically giving them a new mindset in terms of the values of leadership. So political leadership and ethics are so important as part of that process of producing a new kind of political leadership for our continent and our country in particular.
Thank you so much. That was a really interesting journey from sort of serving in the ministerial capacities and also as an advisor to the president, through into your research and the findings, and then of course into the initiatives that you're working on. I think one of the key insights that I take from that is the focus on really identifying the problem in the right way so that you can actually build a solution that addresses the root cause. I'm sure we'll talk about this a bit more, but it would be great to hear, or I would say, let's talk a bit about your time as Vice President of the World Bank for Africa. The bank is a key partner to the African continent with a range of financial instruments currently in place to support economic growth. But prior to the pandemic, what were some of the key long-term political, economic policies and decisions in place to support economic growth in the region? Can you tell us a bit about these from your perspective?
So my time at the bank was 2007 on to 2012. And I think that the key milestone that is important to bear in mind is that it coincided with the period that the continent actually began to do better in terms of its transparency and accountability and good governance record was dismal, really dismal. And so a lot of things were so entrenched in the wrong policies, the wrong choices of investments, and basic weakness of institutions. But in that period, when I became the vice president, we essentially redesigned our strategy with the continent. We decided that our relationship with the countries on the continent wasn't going to be a donor country kind of relationship, that we were going to have a partnership relationship. And so we put with that design essentially meant that we demanded that our own institution should know its own remit and stay within its remit, and that the development process is a locally owned activity, and it's a process that has to be owned by those who desire the development. And so making sure that the countries were taking full charge of their programs that they wanted to work with the bank on was critical, because it really embodies my concept of life, which is take responsibility. We needed our continent to just take responsibility for its development. And that helped, because then it enabled us to have conversations as equals, where we were able to identify what the bank could best do to support countries that have taken responsibility to say, this is where we want to go. This is what we have. This is what we do not have. And this is what we think that the bank is best suited to support us to get to. So that kind of division of labor, partnership, collaboration, and cooperation enabled a process where, if you took a sector like telecommunications, at the time that I became vice president, many of the countries that you see today with liberalized telecom sectors that are really gaining benefits for the economy did not exist. Majority of the countries were monopoly public utilities that were loss-making entities that were corruption infested. But the kind of engagement that we began to have with the continent on the necessary reforms, policy reforms, and regulatory, legal and regulatory frameworks that would be attractive to private capital, changed the story. So today, each time I see some of the former leaders of countries that we advised on the matter of their telecom sector, for example, they remind me of how I beat them on the head with a stick, saying, you have to gain the benefit of technology for your people. It was so important. And, so in those days, leaders would say, oh, the telecom sector is a very, is a secure, it has security implications and all of that. And I would say, no. You're getting it wrong. You can design for a technology sector that does not compromise your security issues. And we have to deregulate this. You're holding back your citizens by not deregulating this sector. And today they look at it and they say, oh my goodness, thank you so much that you presented us with the evidence, because I'm huge on evidence-based policy making. And so I never I only engaged leaders, whether they were presidents, prime ministers, or cabinet ministers, especially those of economy and finance, with evidence. I would show them that, okay, I don't want to be speaking grammar with you. I want you to see evidence of how this worked and evidence of how this did not work. So you are the one in the driver's seat. Now make a decision. So that was the way that our relationship evolved during that period that I was at the bank. And I was so glad because that period coincided with the period where we also focused on getting the macroeconomic framework right for the continent. And so we got relative macroeconomic stability across most of the countries of the continent, which is a necessary condition for economic growth. And so, as countries began to pass healthier budgets, they began to, really pay attention to the fiscal, the monetary policies. They looked at, just running more effective and efficient bureaucracies and looked at those basic issues in improving the business environment. We began to see an Africa that was attractive. That was sustained, at an average of, between 5 to 6%, and that was really great. I remember that the Financial Times, it was The Economist, had in the previous years had an article that called Africa a basket case, right? Hopeless, case. But by the time that I was leaving the bank, there was a publication by the same magazine saying whatever we said before, we recant. That Africa Rising became the cover page, the cover story. And that was for me like, this is wonderful. So the continent really got to working with us as a development institution in ways that drove its own growth by its own self. And we could accompany with the analytical pieces of studies, because people think that the World Bank is all about giving money. No, the most important is actually the how to, because there's an enormous investment in research and studies of all kinds. And then, so you take those things and you are able to use them and adapt them, customize them to the context within which they are going to be used, and it makes a difference. So the knowledge part of the bank is so critical. Africa got a lot of it because I'm huge on knowledge. So we invested a lot of money in generating the right kind of knowledge for African political leaders and policymakers to use. And then our investments were much more leveraged towards sectors where, if you got critical infrastructure and you got investment into human development, health and education, you could improve the productivity of the people and also create a low-cost environment for doing business. And then, the partnerships, we made sure that we could use our convening power on behalf of the continent as much as possible. So, the World Bank is hosting a conversation around investment into agriculture in Africa. All the agriculture companies around the world, if they got an invitation from the World Bank, it's different from when they simply get it from probably a small Guinea-Bissau. They would not show up. But when they say the World Bank Guinea-Bissau, they would show up. So we have to use partnership and our convening power for making that happen on behalf of the continent. So that's, really the story around the way that I worked for the continent. I worked with the continent, for the continent, and by the side of the continent as a VP at the bank.
Thank you. There's a point you mentioned there that is really interesting. I mean, all quite interesting points in general, but there's one that you mentioned that's really interesting, and I'd like to know what you would advise or how you would advise leaders today working on this initiative to approach it. And it's with regards to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement and Free Trade Area. You mentioned the role that the bank played in unlocking resources and laying the groundwork for the private sector in the telecoms industry to flourish. How should the continent be thinking about laying the groundwork for a successful free trade area? I mean, this opportunity or this agreement will open up tremendous opportunities across the region, as long as we're able to get past the initial hurdles of implementation. So how do you think we should be, as a continent, we should be looking at this? And what role do you see some of the key regional institutions playing?
It's for me, it's a thing of joy to see the AFCTA come to pass. It's one of the most significant things that's happened on our continent. And as I said recently to our leaders, we have to go beyond the rhetorics of it and really, get down to work because there's a lot of work to be done. I'd like to say to you that the reason I feel particularly happy about the free trade agreement is that if you Google, you will find it. At the time that I was at the bank, trade was huge for me. And so my mantra was, if Africa cannot trade with the rest of the world, Africa can trade with Africa. And so I laid on the meeting together with the Africa Union Commission to look at can Africa trade with Africa? And it was a major event. And then we went ahead and supported with every technical support in the aspect of trade to the commission, as the economic commissioner would say, Maxwell, is one from Malawi, and then the deputy chairperson of the commission at that time was Mwencha, Erastus Mwencha from Kenya, a man who is well known as trade negotiator and all of that, So we really worked closely with Africa on getting toward this idea of boosting regional trade. At the time that I was at the bank, I found it very dismal that the continental trade was internal trade within the continent was just at about 10% compared to other regions that, of the world that were at an average of 45 to 50%. So we were lagging so well behind. And so it was necessary to interconnect Africa. So the conversation around trade was not important just for trade as an interesting subject to discuss, but it also carried along with it every conversation that we were having, even at the domestic level. You couldn't be trading amongst yourselves if you were not in a place of productivity and competitiveness. And so all the things that would lead to an economy being productive and competitive were necessary to be done in order to prepare African countries to have the cross-border relationship that they needed to have. Because one of the things that we found as part of our studies was that, the non-tariff barriers are more shockingly inimical to trade across Africa than the tariff barriers. And so you needed to deal with a lot of things, whether they were bureaucratic hurdles or they had to do with, just mere financial systems not sticking to themselves, or they had to do with infrastructure. Some neighbors are not in any way connected through infrastructure of any kind, whether by aviation or by roads or by rail, so we had to look at that whole bucket of issues that needed to be fixed. And so you would know that there are things like PIDA, the Program for Infrastructure Development in Africa. That's a very important component of that conversation around Continental Free Trade Agreement, because you had to look at institutional issues, and you had to look at physical infrastructure issues, and then you had to look at the human productivity issues and the bureaucratic issues. And so all of these issues remain important issues on which the continent must make progress, because what you have so far is an agreement. But in order to domesticate and then act on the agreement, you have to have certain critical conditions satisfied, right? So those programs that lead to reforms, those programs that countries need to embark on in order to make their sectors where they have their comparative advantage to really give them the basis to trade with amongst themselves, have to be delivered on. If you don't deliver on them, then the free trade agreement would just be another big aspiration that never got implemented.
Thank you so much. I think one of the key points that I got from that is on the importance of infrastructure in sort of opening up and really connecting some of these neighbors. And then also, interestingly, the groundwork that was laid in your time a few years ago in making the agreement possible today. I agree, it's quite an exciting development. It's quite an exciting development, and it would be interesting to see how it evolves over the coming years.
Yes. It's not infrastructure for the sake of infrastructure, but our emphasis had to be on, and ensuring that you were looking at economic corridors, because there are times when countries go and sink money that they don't have into the wrong kinds of infrastructure. So part of the process of our engagement with the Africa Union Commission, as well as the regional bodies like ECOWAS or EAC or SADC, as the case may be, it was always pointing in the direction of how do you really invest in critical infrastructure that will enable economic growth. So that you can conserve your money and your project selection capacity, your project development capacity would be leading you generally in a direction where you looked at regional integration, not as something that is a nice thing to do. Almost like, what do you call this, kind of a prestigious, it would be a great idea for, Africa to be linked up, so that what happens? So that there can be free movement of goods, of people, of services, right? So you have to think of it, and then you have to think in terms of your growth corridors, you have to think of growth poles, you have to think of how to link the management, the governance of infrastructure, because infrastructure has to be governed. There is a system, there is a process. You think of infrastructure, think of it as logistics. Logistics is a system. And if you don't treat logistics as a system, it undermines your productivity. It can be the difference between Africa being competitive enough to send a product out of Nairobi to New York, as against Bangladesh being able to produce and send to New York. So we got to think of everything, whether it's our physical infrastructure or it's our human infrastructure, as in the human capital, human development issues. We have to think of them on the platform of the governance system for them. Once you can fix the governance system for these things in the development process, you are better off, because your outcomes will be much more viable for you, and very rewarding for your people and for businesses.
Thank you so much. We've talked about governance, and we've talked about sort of the role that international organizations can play, or international regional organizations. We've also talked about sort of the important role of politics in some of these processes. Before we round up, is there any advice that you can give now to businesses that are thinking about positioning themselves to really manage the challenges created by this political atmosphere?
So, yes, the continent has huge political challenges, but no, it is not all bad. Because what we're seeing is increasingly the voice of the citizens is getting louder, and the engagement of citizens in demanding for public accountability and for transparency in governance is helping to improve things. The improvements are not happening quick enough, and especially in countries like Nigeria, where we suddenly have unraveled a lot of gains. I mean, I don't know if you saw the report of the bank recently that, we are back, we're taking back 10 years in terms of economic, economic growth. And that's terrible, because what you have in that case is that you're dropping more people to poverty. And so should not be surprised that you then have challenges of insecurity. Excuse me.
Sorry.
So, thank you. So politically and governance-wise, there are struggles. They must be fixed. If we don't fix these foundational issues, fundamental issues of having political systems, democratic practices, and governance, structures that are fit for purpose, it becomes hard for us to have the kinds of sound policies, the kind of build the right kinds of institutions, make the right kinds of choices of investment in the public good, the public goods that are necessary for economic growth, which is why that responsibility belongs to the citizens of the continent. Nobody, not the World Bank, not the Europeans, not America, not China, can do any of that for us. It's something that we must do ourselves. So the citizens must take up responsibility for fixing politics and governance in their countries. Because from my research, poor governance is the biggest obstacle to improved economic performance of the continent. So if citizens would get out of hoping that some external force would fix their country's governance space, then they would have taken care of the first critical condition for success of countries. Then the second part of my answer to that your question is that even in this atmosphere of challenges, of governance and political risks, there are still sectors on the continent where the private sector is charging forward. And those sectors are often sectors where you have limited interference by government. And so for a lot of the companies that stay away and simply point to Africa as a continent of risks, they are wrong. As a matter of fact, I do say to boardrooms when I get to speak to some of them, that if your CEO has not presented you your company's Africa strategy, they are not what? Being paid by you as CEO. You got to sack them and find a CEO who can anticipate the future, because the future is Africa. Africa will claim the 21st century, no doubt. But as I said, it will take the citizens doing that work of fixing politics and governance. And I believe that we're already showing the way in the things that we're doing in our own country and which other citizens are beginning to do in their countries. Just give the current political class of Africa another 2 decades and they would be gone. And then you would have Africa's young people and Africa's women running government systems that are comparable to government systems that you see in other societies where we've seen rapid improvement in economy. So an example would be when you look at countries in Africa that were equally colonized by Great Britain, then Great Britain, with say Malaysia or Singapore or South Korea. These were, Commonwealth countries. Similarly, as many of the countries in Africa. And yet, these ones have managed to improve governance. And we've seen how it has helped their economic performance. I am predicting that in 2 decades, as the citizens are more engaged in demanding for better politics, better governance of their societies, Africa will get to that place where it begins to govern its space so well. Now, for you as a company that has an interest in to be sustainable into the future, if you're not seeing that Africa now, it's going to be hard for you to start coming in at that time. It is good to be part of the first movers. I can tell you clearly that 40 years ago, nobody imagined today's China. Nobody. The revolution, economic revolution of China is a surprise. Africa's is going to be even more surprising. And the reason is that Africa comes to this space at a time where the power of disruptive technologies, the rapidness, the scale and the speed, the swiftness of changes, of gaining efficiencies because of the sheer power of the technologies that abound, whether you're thinking of it, artificial intelligence, or you're thinking of blockchains, you're talking of simulation, science, big data, and the algorithms. They just think of it. All forms of Internet of Things, all kinds of possibilities are available in Africa's own time of coming into the space for development, compared to even when it happened for China and India. So my advice would be that any company anywhere in the world should be thinking of its Africa strategy and scrutinizing it with a sense of purposeful empirical analysis, and you will be surprised what turns up in the data for you.
Thank you so much. I mean, the big quote that I'm taking from that is Africa will claim the 21st century. I think that's a very powerful reminder to everyone from every sector, and I think is the perfect note for us to round up our talk today. Thank you so much for sharing your insights from, you know, political leadership down to the role that the private sector can play and the way that the private sector should be playing in you know, being a part of this revolution that's going on the continent. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on, and we look forward to having you on another time to, you know, look at the way things have evolved over the years.
Thank you very much, Ugo.
Thank you.